Hey there, welcome back to the Counter Service Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Jacobson, and this is a podcast dedicated to teaching organizations how to learn. More than ever, in 2022, it is essential, it's imperative that companies develop a learning organization within their culture. Well, I've defined learning organization simply as an entrepreneurial, action-oriented organization committed to continuous innovation by optimizing curiosity, creativity, and experimentation, and transforming these new ideas into an impactful future. Well, last time on the podcast, we discussed a very foundational step to developing a learning organization. We talked about cultivating a culture of curiosity, a simple step that can be transformative within your company. And we talked around three major steps around cultivating a culture of curiosity. We said first, it starts with the leadership team, modeling a growth mindset. Secondly, we talked about how a leadership team, it is important to set the environmental conditions for a consistent flow of listening and questioning, investigating, and exploring. And then finally, in the podcast last time, we talked about how autonomy, mastery, and purpose are the drivers to inspire and motivate employees. So cultivating a culture of curiosity is the floor, not the ceiling, when developing a learning organization within your company. Yet, it can be a multiplier to new ideas and to transform your organization. Because when you're ultimately, when you are curious about something or anything, that is where the deepest learning occurs. Think about what you're most curious about right now, and it may be beyond your professional career. Regardless of what that is, what you're most curious about, that's where the deepest level of learning occurs. And this is where the greatest transfer of impact actually takes place. So cultivating a culture of curiosity can be impactful. But today's podcast is really about building upon cultivating a culture of curiosity. And we're going to move forward on the spectrum of the learning organization to establishing a systematic design methodology. And that's what I want to talk about today, to establish a systematic design methodology. Because curiosity and listening and investigating and exploring, that's great. But let's design a methodology that is actually going to be impactful and create much more of a system within our company. So there are two major ways, I believe, to do this. One is to look back to look forward to design a systematic methodology. And then I think there's another way of learning from the future as it emerges. So there are two major components today that I want to talk about. Looking back to look forward and to learning from the future as it emerges. Well, let's look at the first one. Look back to look forward. Consistently, organizations, as Jim Collins would talk about, must conduct autopsies without blame, must confront the brutal facts of your current reality, and to look back with deep reflection and analysis in order to look forward. Well, I want to break this down a little bit about how to look back to look forward. And there's some common ways in which most companies do this. But unfortunately, we don't go deeper. We kind of hang out and kind of circle around one particular methodology. And that's how we run our business on a daily basis. And yet it requires us to toggle back and forth between surface and more deeper aspects of establishing a systematic design methodology. So a commitment to continuous innovation requires a commitment to learning. To look back to look forward, I would simply ask you, how do you diagnose problems? How do you push beyond obvious assumptions? How do you challenge original assumptions? How do you keep from hiding errors? And how can we approach problems in ways that don't repeat the patterns of the past? All important questions. Well, let's explore this further about looking back to look forward. I want to take an influencer for me is Otto Sharma in the book Theory U. He talks about levels of change and approach to change. So the first one, in order to look back to look forward, for most of us, is simply around reacting. Reacting simply means we're responding based on existing habits and routines. So the existing habits and routines that we have established in our organization, when something occurs, this is how we react to it. So that's one way to approach change, is just pure reaction based on existing habits and routines. The next level of approaching change and thinking about looking back to look forward is around this idea of redesign. So you have react, and level 2 is redesign. Redesign is simply about surfacing the current reality, and it might allow us to change some underlying structures and processes. So we go a little bit deeper in just reacting to something based on current habits and routines. We actually may do a little bit more of a deeper reflection as a way to change some structures and processes. So most companies hang out in level 1 and 2, where we're reacting to issues and we're reorganizing structures and processes. That's where most of us hang out when we think of a design methodology. Well, I want us to go deeper than that. And actually, let me give you a quick example before doing that. When you look at level 1 and level 2, maybe an example, which actually, if we're not even doing this is an important tool to really incorporate into our system. An example of a level 1, level 2 of react and redesign is around an after action review. And after something occurs, if you conduct an after action review, you're simply asking the questions around what were our intended results? What were our actual results? What caused our results? And how will we sustain or improve? So when we react to issues and reorganize structures and processes, sometimes we conduct an after-action review. And that's great. And actually, that should be a habit and a routine that's a natural part of the flow of our organization and our company, is to conduct an after-action review. So that's a simple tool. That's something that's an example around that. But if we want to go deeper than just conducting an after-action review and living out in the reacting and redesigning phases, well, let's talk about, as Otto Sharma would talk about, this idea of reframing. Reframing is really around questioning assumptions. It's a reflection on the deep, taken for granted assumptions. Assumptions about that objective, the ways of discovering and inventing new alternatives, objectives, and perceptions, as well as a way of approaching problems. Now, this is not a process of, okay, we had an idea, we prototyped something, we deployed it into the system, we're going to conduct an after-action review, and based on our current habits and routines, we're going to continue to just iterate that process. However, what reframing is actually asking you to do is reflect on your original assumptions. Maybe the original assumptions you had were not exactly correct. Maybe they're 1 degree off, which can be impactful. So how do you create and cultivate this within your organization where you're not just reacting and redesigning, but you're actually reframing the objective. You're reframing the issue. You're reframing the challenge. And out of that, you could actually create new alternatives, objectives, and perceptions. So reframing is a deeper level of analysis, of questioning your original assumptions. So again, to look back to look forward, there are three dynamics to it: react, redesign, or reframe. Those three aspects actually are all essential to establishing a design methodology. But most of us just live in the react and redesign phases. So that is looking back to look forward. Those three components that I want you to continually reflect on and think about within your company, in your organization. Now, an example of reframing, where there's a deep reflection on original assumptions, is a tool called a journey map. There are multiple ways of looking at a journey map. I think Jenny Walters has an interesting approach around her journey mapping. You can look her up and see how she utilizes that tool. But she uses this tool to achieve better outcomes for business. She believes that a customer journey map is a way to understand your customer's true experience with your brand. And the phases range from awareness to purchase to advocacy. And there's several in between that. But an example of a deeper reflection of questioning your original assumptions is utilizing a journey map where you're trying to achieve better outcomes, where you're trying to collect the right feedback, as she would talk about, or involve the right people, and achieve the right results. Because when you understand the real journey, when you deploy empathy and you really focus on the user, then you're going to find, as she would talk about, points of friction. You're going to uncover duplicate efforts. You're going to stress test new products and services. And ultimately, you're going to envision long-term changes. So you're going to, in level 3, this idea of reframing is a deeper reflection on your original assumptions. And a great tool to think about is a journey map around your customers. There are many ways of designing a systematic methodology when you look back to look forward, but that's a great tool to utilize. Okay, well, that's all. Those three dynamics are around look back to look forward. Again, react, redesign, reframe. Well, let's talk about the other dynamic in establishing a systematic design methodology. And this is around learning from the future as it emerges. Well, what does that mean? Learning from the future as it emerges. It's around this idea, as Otto Sharma would talk about, is regenerate. Regenerate is about rebirth, regrow, reform. This is all around purpose and really rethinking original purpose in the work in which you're doing. And this requires the greatest level of emotional and intellectual energy. And most of us are just not willing to go there. So again, we hang out in the react and redesign phase. Maybe we hit on the reframing a little bit, but to regenerate, around to reform, to be reborn, to regrow. This is all around purpose. It is about learning from the future as it emerges. Otto Sharma, in his book Theory U, says leadership teams are wrestling with challenges that cannot be adequately addressed by reflecting on the past. Companies are struggling to succeed in unprecedentedly turbulent, complex, rapidly changing global context. Executives realize that simply reflecting what has happened in the past will not be adequate to help them figure out what to do next. Now, I want to quickly say that I think that you have to function and operate in each of those levels, from react to redesign to reframe, and then ultimately regenerate. I think you have to toggle back and forth when you're establishing a systematic design methodology. And this idea of regenerate and learning from the future as it emerges, I believe, is really focused on this idea of foresight and foresight practice. So what is required to learn and act from the future as it emerges? Organizations, I believe, must develop a sophisticated foresight practice into their work. I've been inspired and now certified through the Institute for the Future in their foresight model. And their foresight model is really focused on identifying and analyzing signals of change, seeing beyond current constraints to identify new possibilities, to leverage hindsight to discover patterns of innovation and disruption, to design future projects that lead to actionable insights, and to build your organization's foresight capacity. And according to the Institute for the Future, and again, they work with major companies, Fortune 50, 500, and 1,000 companies across the globe. According to the Institute for the Future, foresight is not about predicting the future, because there are too many variables and dependencies in play to be able to accurately predict exactly what the world will be like in 5, 10, or even further out. And certainly over the past 2 years has been certainly an example and a tester of that. They go on to say, instead, foresight is about imagining many different futures, positive, negative, weird, and amazing futures. By imagining all of these possibilities we want to live and work in, and then we take practical steps to make those futures likely. So learning from the future as it emerges is building capacity, foresight capacity, within your company and organization. And it requires just such a level of discipline. But this can be so transformative to your organization. An example of foresight practice is beginning to catalog signals of change. To catalog signals of change is simply about scanning your environment, whether that's through online research of examples of new behaviors or products or initiatives, policy positions, community actions or data points, technologies, or any other signal of change. It is about scanning your environment. And sometimes it's scanning your environment beyond your sector and really looking at the landscape of how it could have an impact on your sector, on your business. To develop foresight practice, an example of this is just simply to catalog signals of change. And when you find a signal of change, you should give it a title, you should write a brief description about it, and really think through the implications of that signal. An example of how to do this is when you're whatever you're reading, whatever you're listening to, whatever you're observing, can really be a signal of change. So I don't know, what if with your team you work through a particular exercise around the future of X? So you fill in what that X is, but the future of X. And then you ask yourself the question, the impact of X on the future of X. So what's the impact of an inflationary economy on the future of supply chain? So there are many ways in which you can fill in this example, and I would challenge you and your team to walk through this exercise, the future of X and the impact of X on the future of X. So work through that with your team. And again, signals can be found in science, technology, the economy, environment, and politics. You should be looking at signals throughout each of those categories as a way to catalog them. You should create margin within your company to consistently discuss what are the signals of change that are taking place. And when you create a process to save, share, and tag these signals, you begin to develop a way to analyze in a deeper way and understand how and learn from the future as it is emerging. So you can look back to look forward. You can react and redesign and reframe, all three very important. But how about the fourth one? To regenerate, to learn from the future as it emerges. And that is simply about building foresight capacity within your company. We're going to spend a lot of time in future episodes talking about foresight capacity. And so this is just a high level sort of just a little taste of exactly what it means to do that. Something that the Institute for the Future and others quote often, and I believe it is relevant in this moment, is this quote from William Gibson. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So I think it's important that we cultivate a culture of curiosity, for sure. It is foundational and can be transformational. But I think we should go a little bit further, is really understand what our systematic design methodology is right now, actually label it, and whether it's appropriate or not, and impactful or not. But I think when you establish a systematic design methodology, you're taking a look at what you react to, what you redesign, what you reframe, and then do you even regenerate? All four of those are particularly important when you think about establishing a systematic design methodology. So I've given you a few tools today of how to do that in each one of those particular categories. We're going to go deeper than that in future episodes, but I'm grateful for the opportunity for you to join me today and going a little bit further, not just cultivating a culture of curiosity, but establishing a systematic design methodology. So hopefully this is helpful today. Tell me what you're seeing, you're hearing, you're feeling. Reach out and let me know that. And I enjoy sitting across from the counter and having a conversation with you. So thank you again for joining me on another episode of the Counter Service Leadership Podcast.